Buckeye Nation. Oh, come on now. I thought I used to like you.
My sister got her first big girl job there. So.
Oh. All right. Back to sharing. Okay. All right. So here's what we're working on. But we will not probably get through all of this today. All right. So we've just finished several weeks of studying the aggregate demand side of the economy. We've looked at several models, the income expenditure model, the ISLM model, and the aggregate demand curve. As you know, every model has its weaknesses. These models that we've looked at are no different. The main shortcoming of the demand side models is they don't adequately account for the supply side of the economy, okay? Which means they can't really explain supply shocks, okay? We're experiencing a supply shock right now, and so we want to have a model that will help us understand what the heck is going on. So let's start with a definition. What is a supply shock? Who has an answer?
Like a huge increase or decrease in supply? I'm guessing like in a short amount of time.
What's supply?
Products, items. So
GDP? That was a question. So everybody works really hard. No, let's say it differently. Okay, Macys furloughs 95% of its employees. And as a result, they supply less output. Is that what we mean by a supply shock?
Isn't it more along the lines of exogenous stuff? Like, for instance, right now, the coronavirus is making everybody stay home and not be able to work?
I would say yes to both of those answers. Let's start with a tentative definition, okay? A tentative definition of a supply shock is something that increases or decreases potential GDP. Okay, so that's a start. For example, the classic example of a supply shock is the oil crisis in 1974. Suddenly, oil was way more expensive and hard to come by in many cases, okay? The Arab exporting members of OPEC decided to simply boycott the world, right? And so oil was hard to come by. What that meant was that energy was at least way more expensive and at worst, less available, okay? So the same factory with the same workers was unable to produce the same amount of output because of energy shortages. That's a supply shock. Okay, so traditional demand side models couldn't really explain why economies experienced stagflation. Stagflation is recession and inflation all at the same time. Okay, in fact, when this happened during the 1970s, the dominant school of economics at the time, Keynesian economics, basically got tossed out because they couldn't at the time explain what was going on. Okay. So we need a model that incorporates the supply side. Well, You all learned a model like that in your principles class. It's called basic aggregate demand, aggregate supply, right? Ankitha, did you learn ADAS?
Yes.
Okay, so what's wrong with that model? Why can't we just use that one to solve all our problems here? The answer, well, is a couple things. First, what's on the y-axis of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph? Chester.
Is it price?
It is the price level. Okay, great. The aggregate price level. All right, Joey, this is for you, buddy. What is the current value of the aggregate price level in the US economy?
Oh my goodness. Am I supposed to guess or like know it off the top of my head?
The answer is, I would be shocked if you knew what it was. I don't know what it is. Nobody keeps track of that. Who cares what the aggregate price level is? For one thing, 99% of Americans wouldn't have a clue if you said the aggregate price level. They wouldn't even know what that means. Okay. So the price level is not something that individuals or businesses keep track of. It's not even something that policymakers pay attention to. The Fed does not pay attention to the aggregate price level. Does that surprise you?
A little bit, but I guess there's reasons for it.
Or to put it differently, the models used by the IMF, the Fed, and the US Treasury, the Council of Economic Advisors, none of their models use the price level. Why not? That's sort of a rhetorical question. You know, it's not something that we talk about in textbooks or anything. The answer is because they use something more meaningful. What is the policy variable that they pay attention to?
Employment? Or is it inflation?
It is inflation. Okay, they pay attention to unemployment as well, but everybody has heard of the inflation rate, even if they don't know what it is. But the price level is kind of a mystery. Okay, all the significant macro models that are used by professional economists for explaining or forecasting, they have the inflation rate in them. Okay, that's the most important thing here, right? So we need a model that has the rate of inflation, and that's where we're going. Okay, so the dynamic aggregate supply model has real GDP on the horizontal axis like the regular aggregate supply model, but it has the inflation rate on the vertical axis. So it's way more practical, both from a policy perspective and from a real world perspective, because people understand what inflation is by and large. Okay, do you see where we're going with this? I mean, do you understand what I've said so far? Bo, are you good? Okay. Now, what was I going to say? Oh, I know what I was going to say. I believe that chapter 14 is the most technical, most difficult chapter in the entire book to understand. Okay. It's going to take us a while to dig through this. There's a lot there. Some of it is really important, some of it is less so, but we're gonna do it. Okay. Actually, okay, no, I'm just gonna leave it at that point. Okay, now, oh, I lost everybody. Where did you go? Come back. That didn't work. All right, let me stop the screen sharing and I will start over the screen sharing. That's better. Okay. So where do we start? We start with something known as the Phillips curve. Okay, the Phillips curve. Here is what the Phillips curve looked like back in the day. All right. So there was an economist. Well, let me ask you this. What is the Phillips curve? If you were going to define it, what would you say? Anybody know?
The relationship between employment and inflation?
It's unemployment. It's
Unemployment
the
and
inverse
inflation.
relationship between unemployment and inflation. And now I've lost my PowerPoint again. How do I get that back? Oh, maybe. Let's see. All right. Let me try this. That works. Okay, that worked. Okay. All right. So in the 1950s, A.W. Phillips, who was an economist at the London School of Economics, okay, he was looking at data. He was doing what economists do. He was just playing around with data. And what he discovered for the British economy was that there appeared to be an inverse relationship between the percent change in wages, that is wage inflation, and the rate of unemployment. So he said, well, this is curious. So he pushed back chronologically and got all the data he could for the British economy. And he went all the way back to like the 1850s. And this inverse relationship, like you see on the screen, was still there. And he said, oh my gosh, I've discovered the Phillips curve. Hannah, do you believe me?
No.
He didn't say that. No, he said, I've discovered something that looks really, really interesting here. Okay. You know, usually economists start with a theory and then they look at the data. But in this case, he did it in the reverse direction. Okay, so what this says, high unemployment rate, low or negative percent change in wages, low unemployment rate, high percent change in wages, right? That's exactly what the graph shows there. What's the reasoning behind the Phillips curve here? What did Phillips come up with? What can you come up with? Why should this be true? Let's see. Greg, what do you think?
Say it again.
Yeah, look at the graph. What's the logic behind this? Why, when the unemployment rate is really high, would we expect to see wages actually falling?
Because
While
people aren't getting paid.
it's really low, you expect to see wages rising.
Because people aren't getting paid if they're unemployed. And people are getting paid if they are employed.
Yeah, but that's not quite right. Because what we're talking about is, you know, obviously if you're unemployed, you're not getting paid. But we're talking about really the people that are getting paid.
If the unemployment's low, that usually tends to mean that the economy is doing well, where if the unemployment rate is high, the economy is potentially not doing as well. So
Yeah, when the economy's doing
not paid.
well, labor's hard to come by. You know, if everyone has a job and you're hiring, how do you get somebody?
Increase wages.
Yeah, you have to steal them away from another company by offering them more money than they're currently earning, right? So the lower the unemployment rate, it makes sense that you would expect to see this. If we just think about excess demand for labor, like this graph in figure 2, okay? In figure 2, at the current wage rate, demand for labor exceeds the supply of labor. So what's likely to happen to the wage rate, Quinn? Quinn?
I'm here. Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, look at the graph. When at the current wage rate, demand for labor is high and supply of labor is low. So what would you expect to happen to the wage rate in this situation?
It's gonna fall.
Is that what the graph suggests?
No, it shows it increasing.
It shows it increasing, yeah. If there's an excess demand for labor, unemployment is going to be really low, which corresponds with rising wages. Do you see that?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Similarly, Will, if you have a situation of excess supply of labor with a really high unemployment rate, supply of labor is high, demand for labor is low, what do you think is going to happen to the wage rate here?
It's going to go fall.
It's going to fall. Okay, so that was the reasoning that Phillips came up with to explain his graph. Okay, any questions? Charlotte, I'm disappointed that you're back inside.
I'm sorry. My Wi-Fi just completely gave out.
Yeah, it happens. It happens. So does anybody have any questions about that? Chester with the enigmatic look on his face. Jess, you with us? Good. Yawning. All right.
Sorry.
Go.
I think I'm a little confused in terms of how increasing wages leads to increasing inflation, just because I'm used to hearing that.
We haven't made that step.
Oh, okay. I was wondering, okay. Yeah, never mind.
That is exactly the next step. Okay, so it didn't take long. I think Phillips' paper was published in like 1958. Please turn off your everybody, so we don't get doubles. Thank you. Paul Samuelson, who you may know of as the author of the most popular Principles of Economics textbook in history. Robert Solow of growth model fame. Together, they wrote a paper that was published in 1960, so just 2 years later, where they described the Phillips curve, and they use that name, as the inverse relationship between price inflation and unemployment. So that's what we think of today when we talk about the Phillips curve. Okay, here's what it looks like. Okay, so again, higher unemployment, lower inflation, lower unemployment, higher inflation. But this time we're looking at the percent change in prices, not the percent change in wages. Notice also that this beta term here in the equation is negative. So it's a negative relationship between unemployment and inflation. Okay, now what's the connection between higher wages and higher prices? Or is there a connection at all?
If you have to pay your employees more, you would have to raise the price.
Right, that's exactly it. But not only that, we know that labor cost averages 70% of the total cost of production in the US. So if you raise wages by 10%, then your costs are going up by 7%, 70% of that. Right? And so what you're going to want to do is pass those cost increases on to your customers if you can. It doesn't always happen. I mean, it doesn't always work, but that's the argument, okay? So, and this is a comment for Taya. This is the basis behind cost push inflation. When costs go up, they push prices up, and that's cost push inflation. All right, any questions?
Why did they use the pi symbol for inflation?
No clue. They just did a long time ago.
Fair.
Probably because then you had to use your special symbol font in order to get the thing to work properly. All right. So let's take a look at US data for the 1960s. Here's the Phillips curve for the 1960s. What do you think? Does that look like the graph in the theory?
Yeah, pretty close to it, right?
It does. It does. So the Phillips curve was quickly adopted by mainstream economists, especially Keynesian economists. And during the 1960s, it came to be viewed as a policy menu. Okay, that was true whether you were a conservative economist or a liberal economist. The idea was you could choose, or I should say an administration could choose where they wanted to be on the Phillips curve. Okay, so if you were a Democratic administration, you would want to be at a point like B, where you reduce the unemployment rate, and if it cost you a little bit of inflation, that was okay with you because at least you were protecting working people. If you were a Republican administration, you would want a point like A because, after all, inflation eats away the value of our wealth, especially for rich, especially if we're talking about financial wealth. And so much better to lower the inflation rate. And if it results in some layoffs, well, that's just the price you pay. So when Democratic administrations came into power, we kind of moved this way on the Phillips curve. When Republican administrations came into power, we kind of moved that way on the Phillips curve. So that's the policy menu idea. All right, any questions about that? All right. Unfortunately, and this happened really in the end of the 60s and going into the 1970s, when policymakers tried to exploit the menu, something strange happened. What I'm going to show you is the graph of inflation versus unemployment from 1960, but all the way to 1989. Okay, 60s, 70s, 80s, 30-year period. Nope, that's not it. It's the next one, that one. Here's the 1960s right here. Now, those of you who've had econometrics, if you were gonna run a regression through that set of dots, what would it look like?
Wouldn't it be an upward slope?
It looks a lot to me like an upward sloping line, something like this, which says there's a positive relationship between inflation and unemployment, not a negative relationship. Okay, that's not actually what's going on here, but I think you can see why this is problematic. Okay, any ideas what's going on?
There's two separate Phillips curves.
There's actually three separate
three,
Phillips
yeah.
curves. There's one here, and then it shifted out to here, and then it shifted out to here, and it even shifted a fourth time out to here. All right. But in the beginning of the 1970s, we hadn't figured that out yet. We just thought everything had gone off the rails. Okay, so now we need to figure out what was going on. And to do that, we're going to introduce something called the job search theory of unemployment. But before that, I want to give you a frame, kind of a bigger story that's going on here. Okay. So the answer to the question of what happened to the Phillips curve in the 70s and the 80s is something called the expectations augmented Phillips curve that I'm going to explain in detail. Okay. The expectations augmented Phillips curve explains the shifting of the curve. Okay. And what's interesting is it was devised independently by two economists. One was Milton Friedman, who was a monetarist economist, if you're familiar with monetarism. And the other, he was at the University of Chicago, and the other economist was Edmund Phelps, who was a pretty serious Keynesian economist at the University of Pennsylvania. So when you have a Keynesian and a monetarist coming up with essentially the same theory at the same time, it makes you think they're probably onto something. Okay, so let's figure this out. Okay, we need to start with some definitions here. First is, what is the natural rate of unemployment? What does that mean, natural rate of unemployment?
If there were no shocks to any of the markets, that this is where the unemployment would eventually come to rest.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Anybody else want to add to that?
Isn't it like where the level of unemployment lies naturally when the system is like perfectly functioning, kind of?
And when is that?
When labor demand, labor supply are the same, maybe? No.
Really, what you're saying is pretty much just what Rob said. When there are no shocks in the long run, the unemployment rate settles at something that we call the natural rate. Okay, but there's another way to think about this. We know that unemployment can be divided into at least 3 categories, actually 4 categories. We can talk about structural unemployment, we can talk about frictional unemployment, we can talk about cyclical unemployment, and we can talk about seasonal unemployment. We're not going to worry about seasonal unemployment because over the course of a year, it washes, okay? There are fewer jobs for lifeguards in the winter. There are fewer jobs for construction workers, but if you look at it annually, those jobs are there. Okay, so what is structural unemployment?
That's unemployment from changes in the economy.
Okay, like?
The loss of, say, like the manufacturing sector that shuts down due to costs being cheaper elsewhere. Those jobs are lost, and then people have to retrain to go into a different sector.
People who are structurally unemployed either lack skills or the skills they have are no longer valued in the market, in the labor market. Okay, so a classic example of that is in the early 1970s, we were shutting down the space program in the US. And so there were very skilled aeronautical engineers who suddenly found themselves without work. The problem with structural unemployment is that it's permanent or semi-permanent. It requires serious retooling, retraining, re-education. And that's expensive. And if you're unemployed, it's hard to come up with the money for those things. Okay. So what happened to blacksmiths when the automobile was invented? Quinn, blacksmiths when the automobile was invented.
I mean, they probably would have been useful for a while, but then with the development of new machinery, they no longer were.
Well, as more people adopted car transportation and not horse transportation, the demand for blacksmiths dropped significantly. In the early 20th century, up through the early 20th century, this is a different example. If you used an elevator, there was an elevator operator. There were no buttons in the elevator. There was a dial. One way was up and the other way was down. And the operator, you get in the elevator and the operator would, if he'd say, you know, what floor please? And you'd say 7th floor, and he would say, okay. And he would shut the doors, and then he would dial up and the elevator would go up, and he would watch the numbers until you got to the 7th floor. And then he would stop the elevator, open the doors and say, okay, we're here. All right. When they invented the operatorless elevator with buttons, what happened to all of those people who were elevator operators?
They were out of a job.
Yeah, they were structurally unemployed. Here's something that is more contemporary. You know, if you don't believe me, ask your parents. Not that long ago, there was no such thing as self-service gas. You pulled up to the gas station and one of the employees came out and opened your gas cap and said, you know, what'll it be? And you'd say, fill it up with regular or fill it up with high test. And they would put the hose in your car and they would turn on the gas pump. All right. And in fact, to this day, well, at least the last time I checked, in New Jersey, it is illegal to pump your own gas. It's considered a safety threat because you could accidentally start a fire or something. So if you are driving on the Jersey Turnpike and you stop for gas at one of the rest stops, there's a guy who will pump your gas for you. It's kind of weird. It's an anachronism. But in most other places of the world, all of those people who pumped your gas, they found themselves out of work. Okay, think about the number of people employed at a gas station these days, especially a gas station that doesn't do auto repairs, right? How many people run the gas station?
One or two.
Huh?
One or two.
Yeah, exactly. That's all you need with self-service, right? Okay, so all of those people that used to have jobs pumping gas and checking your oil and things like that, they're all structurally unemployed. Okay, now, who can I pick?
Well, is there a lot of training necessary to operate an elevator or pump gas? I mean, how?
Absolutely, sure. Hold that thought. Okay, Chester, here's a question for you. Chester, are you personally concerned about those gas station attendants who are permanently unemployed because you pump your own gas? Does that bother you?
Didn't this happen a while ago?
It did.
Wouldn't they have found other work by now?
No, they're permanently unemployed. By definition, structurally unemployed people pretty much never find jobs again, at least not like the ones they had. I'm guessing you probably have not really even thought about this before. And that's okay, because in the long run, those people retire, they leave the labor market, they die, they're gone, right? It's not a thing anymore. While they're unemployed, it is a problem. And if you look at the data, you'll find that we do have structurally unemployed people in the US today. Okay. How would you find them? Just looking at the data that's available from the BLS.
People who stay unemployed for a long amount of time.
Yeah, that's what I would do. One of the data filters they have is how long have people been unemployed. So if you find people that have been unemployed for more than 6 months or a year, they're probably structurally unemployed. That's what I would do. Okay, the other way to do it is look at unemployment by skills, but that's not perfect, and that's harder to do. Okay, so anyway, that's structural unemployment. It's where you don't want to be. All right. Rachel, no dog today?
She peed on the mat of this room as class started, and so I threw her in her crate.
Awesome.
So no.
Yes, and you asked me why I don't have pets. Are you going to get in trouble for being a bad pet sitter because of that?
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. Good. I'm glad to hear that. All right. Okay, so we have structural unemployment. We also have frictional unemployment. What is frictional unemployment?
People between jobs.
Yes. How is that different from structural unemployment? I mean,
usually a short term, so they have another job within 6 months.
Isn't anyone between jobs? Isn't anyone unemployed between jobs?
Wouldn't it have less to do with having the necessary skills and more to do with just not having enough people that are hiring, just not enough firms that are hiring employees?
No, that's not it. But you're on the right track. Okay. Who's hiring in Fredericksburg these days? Hannah?
I have no idea.
Okay. I'm gonna make the claim that that there are some places, or at least last month, there were places that were trying to hire people. Okay. I know for a fact that Walmart is hiring, Amazon is hiring, okay, and grocery stores in general are hiring, okay. But how do you find that information out? Even in the world we live in today, information is still a little bit scarce at times, right? There is the perfect job for Hannah in Nashville, Tennessee. Okay. How would you find that job?
Today, I'd probably Google it. Like,
Sure, but you wouldn't Google the perfect job in Nashville. You'd Google something for the kind of job that you were looking for, right? Okay, so when we talk about frictional unemployment, what we mean is the period of time during which people are unemployed. Even if there's a job out there for them, it takes time for you to find the employer and the employer to find you. Okay. Imagine, well, this is going to be hard. Imagine trying to find a job before the internet. What would you do?
You'd ask around for like friends and family.
Sure.
Job openings in newspapers.
There used to be job openings in newspapers. Yes. There's still some of that. There is a newspaper called the Chronicle of Higher Education that comes out Monday through Friday. It is the #1 trade journal for college professors and administrators. And if you want a job as a college president or a dean or a high-level administrator, and also for some faculty positions, they have those ads in the Chronicle. You can actually go look. Okay, but in most places, we've gotten more efficient than that. Okay. in the economics profession, before the internet, we were pretty efficient at finding academic jobs. There is a publication called Job Opportunities for Economists, okay? And pretty much every faculty position in North America advertises in Job Opportunities for Economists. So when I was looking for a job, that's where I looked. I didn't actually subscribe to the thing. I went to a library and I got the magazine. It came out monthly and I looked for jobs that looked interesting. Okay, Job Opportunities for Economists, which we call the JOE, J-O-E, still exists, but now it's on the internet, it's digital, and it works even better than before, okay, because of all the affordances of the internet. Okay, so what I expect is that the average period of frictional unemployment before the internet and after the internet has probably dropped significantly, but it's still there. There's still some time. Okay, another way to think about this is frictional unemployment isn't generally considered a major social problem in the same way that structural unemployment is. Structurally unemployed people probably aren't going to be able to work again. And so we're going to need to support them. Frictionally unemployed people are going to find a job eventually and probably fairly quickly, assuming that we're not in a recession or something like that. Okay. In normal times, it takes Mary Washington economics majors about 6 months to find a job, a permanent job, not a for now job, not a find a job as a bartender or a server just to pay the rent, but a permanent job. In normal times, it takes about 6 months. Okay, that's frictional unemployment. Okay. Okay, what about cyclical unemployment? What is that?
That where we are in the economic cycle.
Exactly. Okay. Layoffs are cyclical unemployment. Okay. The idea is that, well, like Macys today announced that they're furloughing all of these people. Okay. It's not that you're never going to have a job again, but business is bad for the company. And so they're laying you off temporarily. That's cyclical unemployment. Okay. In good times, cyclical unemployment goes away. In bad times, it gets bigger. Okay. So going back to the original question of the natural rate of unemployment, okay, when we talk about full employment, what we mean is the absence of cyclical unemployment. Okay, the natural rate of unemployment means the measured level of unemployment where there is no cyclical unemployment. Okay, over time, the amount of frictional unemployment can change and the amount of structural unemployment can change. But in general, we're stuck with those things. It's cyclical unemployment that accounts for the largest rises and falls in unemployment. And so the natural rate of unemployment is the rate of unemployment when there is no cyclical unemployment. Okay, any questions about that?
Would seasonal unemployment be considered a type of cyclical unemployment?
No, And the reason why is because if you're seasonally unemployed, you'll be rehired in the next season. So it's not, so it's only a matter of months probably that you would be unemployed. Also, there's evidence that seasonal employees get paid more than they're worth during the season to compensate them for the fact that that part of the job is being unemployed some of the time. Other questions?
So I know you were talking about for structural unemployment, where we would find that if we were going to like look at statistics from BLS.
Mhm.
What would you have to look at to be able to see frictional unemployment? Or would that be something difficult to see?
Yes, it would be. If there were a measure of very short-term unemployment, people that are only unemployed for a month or 2 months or something like that, that would be frictional unemployment probably. But it's hard. It's a little more complicated to measure that, because if you're structurally unemployed or cyclically unemployed and you've been that way only for a month, you would show up in those monthly statistics, right? So it includes some other folks as well. So there are people who argue that we should cut the social safety net, cut welfare, make it harder for people to get on food stamps, because that way they'll have an incentive to get back to work sooner. All right. To the extent that their argument has merit, what they're talking about is frictional unemployment, people that actually have choices, right? Nobody, it's probably the case that nobody is cyclically unemployed because they wanted to be on welfare, because they would earn much more by working than they would by being on welfare. Other questions?
So going back to the policy menu, how exactly would administrations kind of pick the point that they wanted to be at?
If you were at A and you wanted to be at B, you would use expansionary monetary and fiscal policy to pump up the economy and move you up. And if you were at B and wanted to be at A, you do the opposite.
Okay.
There is such a thing as the political business cycle. There's evidence that presidents at the end of near the end of their 4-year term try to pump the economy up and make the economy look good so that they'll be reelected. I know that's hard to believe, that economists could be, that politicians could be so shallow, you know, but trust me on that one.
I said, reminiscing with old photographs of the residents, picking out flower seeds to grow in the garden, reading the newspaper, the baby doll that we have.
Any other questions?
Very intriguing stuff.
All right, well, that's it for today. We will continue this on Wednesday.